Hello, everyone. Good afternoon or good evening from Berlin. Good to be here with you virtually, even though I cannot see you or most of you. Good to know that you're there somewhere around the globe. As you said, Lakshmi, this is our 4th edition of the Tech Forum, and those who have been there over the past years already know we will talk about machine readable standards. This time again, apparently we have subscribed to the topic, and so you might ask the question, are we telling the same story again? And I would say yes and no. Yes, because our main message still is we have to connect, we have to work together to achieve the goal of providing machine readable standards in a coherent way to our end users. And no, because the topic of smart standards has of course developed further the last years. The question of why, namely to support our customers' digital transformation and to keep us relevant as suppliers of technical rules, can be answered more concretely today than it was a few years ago. Because the question of why is more relevant than ever. Actually, this is a very fundamental question whenever we change the status quo of our ecosystem of standardization. And I think perhaps you know there's a very famous German philosopher who said that there are so many solutions that are still looking for their problem. I think for us, the question of what is the problem in terms of and what might be the right solution in terms of what benefit can we expect from machine readable standards must be the basis of all our efforts in this field. And it can only be answered by listening to our users, by our end users, and understanding what their requirements are today and how they will change in the future. Think about advancing pressure, but also chances of digitization. And so what are the resulting requirements that we have to take into account when we think about different ways of providing standards? I'm therefore particularly pleased that we have Tom Shortall from Shell with us today, again this year. Many of you will know him from past years. And he will tell us something about the comprehensibility of standards and his understanding of good requirements writing and how they use standards. But before we hear Tom, we will have a look at examples of initiatives to digitize standards in the US and in Europe. And from API, we have Scott Garten and David Miller with us, who will give us an insight into their project, first results and lessons learned, followed by Joe Collins from the Netherlands, Nan, and myself from DIN, who will give you an insight into the European pilot project on smart standards and what we have learned so far. And as Lakshmi said, please put in your questions in the chat. We will walk through, we will present through, and then pick up the questions. And if you want to address questions to specific topics or presenters, please add the name of the presenter you would like to address the question to. And with this, I would like to hand over to Scott and David for the first part of the presentation from API. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. My name is Scott Garten. As Sebastian mentioned earlier, I'm the Director of Intellectual Property and Distribution at the American Petroleum Institute. I'm joined by David Miller, who's API's Director of Standards, and today we're going to walk through API's investment in digitization and smart standards. So over the next few minutes, we will discuss API's background, our organization, some of the things that will impact the decisions we make for investment and that will impact digitization, the current status and some of the technical investments that we've made over the past few years, as well as a pilot we did with Incosi, and then some of the steps that we're taking to position API to best serve its members and internal and external stakeholders in the future. So most of you are familiar with API and the standards that we create, but it's really important to understand that API is an SDO inside of a very large US trade association. And as a trade association, API is a representative and advocate for over 600 oil and gas companies in the US federal, state, and local governments. The department within API that promulgates and distributes the standards is the Global Industry Services Department. That's where David and I work. It also supports many other programs, training, monogram, systems programs that support our industry. it's in many ways a multinational company that is governed by a committee that is composed of member companies and executives from those companies to help us understand some context and nuances for the decisions we make as a business. So this is an important distinction to make, because there are times when we have and we will have different trajectories around digitization and the investments we make from our other peer SDOs because of our organization, because of the guidance that we were receiving from our members and our stakeholders. So I don't want to get too much into this this model, but because it will be discussed in much greater detail in coming slides. But according to IEC's utility model of SMART standards, API's current level development is a level 2, where we have machine readable documents. So for years, API has created XML formatted documents, but it's done mostly through outside partnerships with ASTM and BSB Edge. In fact, we have over 870 documents that are currently XML formatted. 2019 is when we brought that capability in-house. And that year we published 17 documents with the accompanying XML. This year we expect to publish 31 documents with the accompanying XML. And next year we anticipate having over 60 documents published with the accompanying XML. So this is an in-house capability that we continually ramp up and will continually invest in because of the requirements that we are hearing about and the market demands that we are that we receive from, again, internal and external stakeholders as well as partners. So the two technologies that we have embraced and that produce these in-house XML formats are Anair Xstyles and Typify automated publishing. Anair is a Microsoft Word plugin that allows us to create NISO STS XML formatted documents, and then Typify will allow us to take that XML formats and produce multiple formats of the document, whether it's print PDF, interactive PDF, mobile-friendly outputs, as well as provide a consistent layout for often complex design and content elements, all the while decreasing or eliminating the need to manually format the document. So these are the investments. These are the tools that we're using, that David Miller's team is using to, again, publish the documents, but do so in a way that meets future and current demands. I'm biased, but I think that the most evident example of an output that is available or created by an XML format is visible through the API Compass platform. It's a very powerful tool that ASTM created, and we're partnering with them to support our online subscription sales. The capabilities that this tool has is really best in class, and that is because of the XML formatted documents that will then be converted to XHTML and allow for a very specific and unique end user experience. Again, this is a technology that we'll continually invest in. This is, I think, the future, but it's really only part of the story. So to tell a little bit more about our story, I'm going to pass to David Miller so he can explain an INCOSE pilot program that we recently did.
Great, thank you very much, Scott, and thank you for everyone's attendance and participation today. I will just mention in some of those earlier slides when he was talking about some of the software we're using, many of those learnings came from attendance and participation and support for this tech forum. So if you're wondering, well, what am I going to get out of this aside from listening to a bunch of folks talk all day, you really will learn a lot. So I would encourage you to stay through the day and to participate in the Zoom breakouts when we finish up in the networking. But as Scott mentioned, we're a trade association. We look to, convene, collaborate, and find consensus on topics. And in particular, here, we worked with the INCOSE Oil and Gas Working Group. Now, what their remit is to influence standard bodies, and we're listed there: API, ISO, ASTM, etc., to move documents, from a data, to a database, and to modify the format and structure of their requirement documents to separately identify measurements, rationale, verification. So you can sort of see all the words there, but really what we're trying to do with INCOSE in this particular pilot project on 17.0 was to sort of move our documents from what we call a narrative-based approach to a standards as data or machine readable or something that will be much more usable going forward as we move into this digitization space. And these slides are courtesy of an INCOSE presentation that was made earlier this year, so I want to thank them for allowing me to use these. But this shows you sort of what that path was when we pulled the group together. The 17.0 project, and that's our recommended practice on high integrity pressure protection system. So basically an offshore safety system standard. What we really found was that, as our second pilot activity, the first one was in 2017 on API 17X, and 17X was on subsea pump module systems. And what we found on doing the 17X work was, since that standard was still in the development phase, since work was still ongoing with it, it was pretty difficult to sort of get our arms around, moving it from that narrative into that standards as data or digitization space. And so we had a lot of lessons we learned from that. So then we said, well, let's try another one. INCOSE and API both said this is worth doing. There's value in this. This is what our members are telling us. This is what we're seeing, obviously, in the marketplace with folks like Scott and others that help us there. This is what we need to do. We need to continue to work this. So we agreed to have another project, and you can see the sort of the timeline. You'll sort of see what some of the lessons learned are, that, we need to look at each requirement and create a smart version. We focus particularly on sections 4 through 7. So the way the API standards are structured, we have a very specific criteria. The scope is always section 1, definitions always 2, etc. And so we were really looking at 4 through 7 sort of being, the guts of the review. And what we found was that a rough estimate of the time to do this work was about an hour per page without having the SMEs directly involved. Obviously, when you bring them back in, you would no doubt spend additional time, because one of the challenges we have in all of our standards, the way they're structured now, and this is not, uncommon to API, I think, is that in addition to the requirements, there's often quite a bit of sort of industry best practices, lessons learned, risk avoidance from the SMEs. They come around the table and say, well, hey, we had this experience at that particular or this experience at that particular platform. So therefore, they want to incorporate those knowledge learnings into the standard. And so you've got to be very careful about how you treat those requirements. What we've really determined is that, for us to be successful in this space, for us to work with our, many subject matter experts and the member company representatives, we need to work it from both a, top down. We need to have a policy and an approach, and certainly we're framing that up, and we'll get to that in just a minute. But it also needs to be, bottom driven. And so what we've done is we've now incorporated a digitization section in our API document format and style manual. So that's the basic guidance on how all these documents are structured. We've added this digitization section here where we talk about, moving from that narrative-based approach to requirements-based standard. This is available, on our website. We've taken the INCOSE definitions, we've modified them a bit, and yes, we do have, approval from INCOSE to do this. We're always very mindful of copyright issues, but this way we're going to try to drive the change that we're looking to achieve here within API and within, the industry into, both, having a policy at the top level of why we're doing this, why we're investing in these particular pieces of software, but then also bring that from the volunteers. And so we're going to take this document, and I've shared it with our training manager, and we're going to be putting together some training materials for our subject matter experts and start rolling that out next year, because we really need to get them to really have that mindset change and to get on board with us sort of going in this direction. So that's a little bit about some of the lessons learned and some of the pilot projects we've undertaken. Now I'll throw it back over to Scott, who'll have a few more comments about where we're going in the future.
Thank you, David. So we did a quick recap on some of the investments that we've made and some of the pilots that we've done to understand where our gaps might lie, and we're continuing that analysis, to be blunt. And so some of the things that we are doing to better understand how we move from level 2 to level 3 or level 4 will involve more direct involvement or more direct interaction with our members and our customers, as well as information gathering group that our GISC created and that David Miller is leading. David will talk to the EITF as well as some of the questions that we uncovered and that we're hoping to address with this new task force. David?
Great, thanks, Scott. So when we think about digitization, when we first posed this to our Global Industry Services Committee, and as Scott had in one of the earlier slides, that's the top level policy committee within the Global Industry Services Group that looks after all of our programs. And we said, well, let's talk about this. When, how do we define digitization? There's all kinds of different definitions out there. But really, does industry support us moving from this requirements-based approach, from the narrative approach? What are those implications of making those changes as people want to then take those standards and customize them for their own use? And more importantly, is how do we make sure that we meet the needs of the members while maintaining fiscal responsibility? Because they do look for us to have all of our programs in the Global Industry Services Group, to be self-supporting, to essentially, pay the freight, so to speak, to keep the work going on. And fortunately for us, the way that we've structured our systems, we also take some of the proceeds from our standard sales and reinvest those in basic research to make the standards better. So we have a lot on our plate, and we just want to make sure that when we go down this path that we've got full support of our members. So as I mentioned, we posed these subjects to our Global Industry Services Group, and we proposed to them that we create an Emerging Issues Task Force, or an EITF. So you see the remit here. They're the ones that are going to look at these cross-section segments, technology and performance related issues. And then those are the companies that are represented there right now on the EITF. We actually have just added another one just in the last week or so. But really the first charge the EITF has been given is to help API really understand the digitization space and really give us direction on where they want us to go with our standards program. So as you can see, as I said earlier in my remarks, we're really looking at this from the standpoint that to be really successful, we have to work directly with our members at the top level. That's our policy group. We have to have that policy direction, but then we also have to have that support and that participation from the volunteers. Sort of winning the hearts and the minds, to use sort of an old phrase, because they're the folks that, as everyone on the call knows that today that works in this space, those subject matter experts, those volunteers, they're really the ones that make the difference in how your program and how your standards turn out. So you've got to bring them on board as well. So now I'll turn it back over to Scott for just a few closing things on other projects that he's working on.
Yeah, so we have two projects that they are. One of them is in partnership or in conjunction with a channel partner or a third party that delivers the content to the end users through a technical platform that they own. And another project is one where we are delivering formatted data directly to a member company in support of some of their research and development. So in both cases, we have an NDA. I don't want to get into too much details, but we are learning a lot about how digitization will impact our business model. And really the industry business model, and how we can better serve the members and the end users that we've been serving for the past 100 years, but in a little bit different way. So on behalf of David and API, thank you very much for your time. If you have questions, feel free to reach out to us, and I will pass it back to Sebastian.
Yes, thank you.
Scott, David, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your interesting presentation. Looking forward for questions from the audience to them answered at the end of our presentation. We will now go to a short presentation of the European pilot project we are very engaged in, not only NEN and DIN, but many other European NSBs as well. As I said in my introduction, for us, a very basic initial question is the question of the why. Why are we doing this? And so this leads to the objective of our project of smart standards, and it's really very short and high level here, but of course, in the context of digitization of processes of our customers, we have to think about digitization of our products and of our own processes as well. And the aim is to provide standards content in a way that it can be directly used in customers' processes, directly used by machines, directly used by software. And so the idea is to make these processes more efficient and also to raise quality of the usage of standards. And when we say smart standards, we mean smart in two different dimensions. And perhaps it's important to understand because we will make further reference to these two dimensions of smart. So smart, in the sense ISO is using, smart is the first definition of standards: machine, applicable, readable, and transferable. And the other definition, which you might know from the definition of objectives of targets, for example, of requirements, is specific, measurable, assignable, realistic, and time-related or time-bound. And so, as I said, this is important to know. Yes, please, to this slide. When we look at the value chain and the impact smart standards will have on our value chain, we know that, or we have to bear in mind that smart standards will impact the whole value chain from content creation to content management, content delivery, and content usage. But as I said, when we think about the benefit of smart standards, we try to answer the question from going from the right to the left. So starting with the content usage, trying to understand how our users are using our content, what are actual restrictions they have using the content, and what might be solutions to overcome these restrictions. And so the question at the right of this value chain is, at which point in the customer process, what exactly is required in terms of types of provision, in terms of formats of standards. And then we can go back, of course, and answer the question, what do we need to change in our content creation on the left side here? So what is the information model? What is the structure of smart standards? And in the middle, very important questions of what is the right infrastructure to support a different way of creating content, of creating smart content, and what is the interface to the user? So if we provide documents today, what might be in the future smart services providing granular content to very different customer processes? How can we derive from a hopefully generic general model of smart standards to very specific use cases of our standards users? So this is for us an important model or approach, one approach to explain what we understand regarding the objective of smart standards and what is the impact along our value chain. There's just an example, to give you an example, not to deep dive into details, but just to show you what in the discussions with our customers is the important point of the benefit in terms of the business case for our users, because what you can see here in the red circle is basically what we provide today. Today we provide PDF documents, standards in PDF, and this is like the interface to our customer, and then it's up to our customer to read the document, to identify the right content, for example, requirements, extract the requirements, transform them in a way that their own systems, this is here, for example, in the green circle, that their own systems can use these requirements in their subsequent processes. So a subsequent process might be, for example, in an engineering project that you can find at a glance all the requirements that are relevant for a specific project, a specific use case or whatsoever. So this is basically what is then being done at the customer side. And so our idea is not to replace the whole process at the customer, but our idea is to choose a step approach where we say, okay, the first step would be that we're not providing stupid PDF documents anymore. We're providing something else. We're providing a standard, and we're also providing, for example, granular elements such as requirements that are easily to identify. They are tagged with an ID and some other meta information that is needed in order to use them in the customer process. And if you think about this red circle, we can replace this red circle because it's not longer an added value by the customer, but it's something that we can provide with different types of provision of standards. This is part of the business case finally, and part of our motivation to do this. And it's also, I mean, this is not the question we have to answer right now, but at some stage we will have to find an answer to the right pricing, for example. And this is something we should refer to when it comes to the question, what is the cost of a smart standard? What's the price we can achieve? What is the willingness of our customers to pay higher prices for a smart standard than they do today for a PDF document. And with this, I hand over to Joe to present the utility model, which is the second very important approach to understand smart standards.
Yeah, my objective is not as such to present the utility model, but it's a model which I think, as you saw with the presentation by API, which has gained some use with different standards bodies. In Europe, it helped us to understand where we are, where we've come from, and where we want to go. So I think what we would say at this particular stage is that the majority of us are either at level 2 or moving towards level 2. Some of us have all our content already converted into XML. Some of us are still in the process of converting standards into XML, of bringing in the standards, for instance, in the case of the European standards bodies from ISO, IEC, and CENELEC, in order to complete our collection of XML standards. So the majority are either at level 2 or still working on level 2. The objective of the project at the moment, as we've defined it, is to move from level 2 to level 3. That's certainly the objective of the present pilot projects which are taking place in Europe at the moment. Level 4, as of the moment, we've put on hold in order to concentrate on what's required in order to be able to make that move from level 2 to level 3. If you just look at the description here, and I'm not going to go into massive detail because I know last year, for all those who attended the forum last year in New York, that Ivan gave an extremely good and detailed explanation about, amongst other things, around the utility model. But if you just look at level 3, what it says here, machines can isolate specific types or instances of content, components, and perform more complex actions based on the content. To go into slightly more detail on that, and just to kind of begin with 0, some of us remember the phase when we were still at level 0, when all we could offer our customers was paper. We then moved, certainly, and then we moved at the end of the 90s to PDF. As I said, we've now moved to XML, which some of us are already able to offer our customers access to HTML standards in our platforms, which again obviously offers more functionality. What it doesn't do is give the opportunity, or it doesn't make the content any more intelligent. It's still basically a closed piece of content without any granular identification of the content. And essentially what we are attempting to achieve with level 3 is to move to that more granular content. As it says here, semantic description of tagging, advanced search on meaningful and defined elements, basic capabilities to find and process elements like graphs, formulas, executable code. So it's a step that we're attempting to move to at the moment. So if you look at where we are in Europe at the moment, last year we also talked about some of the work that we've been doing in Europe. At the beginning of this year, we put down the final reports from the first 2 pilots that we conducted, the construction pilot and the petroleum pilot. In both of those reports, there were a whole series of recommendations to CENELEC about the next steps that were needed to be taken. Amongst those was the need to continue on the process of discovery of what we actually need to do. Some of the participants then moved to consolidate the results of those pilots into the beginnings of an information model, which could lay the basis for the following pilots, which we agreed to do in order to test out that model. The 2 pilots which are now in the process of actually testing the model are one on product standards, which we agreed in order to identify whether there are any unique qualities to product standards which would mean that we would need to adapt the information model. The second was on a new work item, because I think as our colleagues from API just explained, one of the most difficult things, we can come up with a model, we can come up with ideas about how the standards need to be created in a different way, but then obviously the experts in the technical committees have to be able to work with that. So the idea behind the new work item was to work in practice with the experts in technical committees to attempt to create content from scratch based on the information model, and also at the same time to actually test out the model itself and to test out whether the model contained all the necessary information that was required. The intention of both of these pilots is at the end to create a new and refined information model, but also to have more understanding of the implications of working with such a model on the processes, on the organization, on the tools within standards development. What we've also said is that what we're going to focus on at this particular stage is the requirements. Now, obviously, you've heard in the past, in the previous years when we've talked about this, also in the presentation just now from API, the importance of requirements. At the moment, we've advised all of the standards bodies participating in the pilots to set up their own stakeholder groups in order to get understanding from end users how they actually use the standards. Sebastian just gave an example of a customer that they've talked to. We've talked to customers in the past who've explained to us that because of the nature of the standards at the moment, written as prosa documents, narrative as colleagues from API just called it, that it's virtually impossible for them to isolate and extract the requirements to use within their own systems, which is one of the reasons that we've decided to focus first and foremost on the requirements. But it's also linked to this issue of how do you actually write smart requirements, which has been, as I say, the main focus of the project at this particular moment. But also I had a discussion, for instance, with one of the participants in our stakeholder group at NEN. And one of the things that he also told me was that within, people work with multiple standards. They're not working generally with a standard. They're working with multiple standards. They then have multiple references, sending them from one document to another. And he told me that it sometimes takes them days in order to actually begin to isolate the requirements which they actually need in order to carry out the job which is needed at that particular moment. This is quite difficult to explain in a presentation, but in essence, this is one of the elements of the information model that we've developed. Another element, Sebastian will explain in a minute, around the triples. We've called this the smart structuring table, and it's essentially aimed at the issue of how do you write smart requirements. It contains a number of elements, and essentially what we're saying is that in order to write a smart requirement, it needs to contain a number of these elements. It wouldn't be all for each requirement. It would depend obviously on the requirement. But first of all, the system, the specific system or object that will deliver the required performance, the action that needs to be taken or the service that needs to be provided. Then you have the performance, a measurable performance that's required, the conditions under which the action takes place, the margin, the tolerance or limit of the required performance are the elements which need to be involved. One of the ones that I've missed out is the actor, which again has always been a slightly complicating issue, but it's for whom or what the service should be provided. So on the basis of this, and I would say just again linking back to what we heard from API, this is very much based again on the systems engineering approach. So there'll be very, very many similarities between the model that we've developed and I suspect also the work that's been done at API so far together within COSI. What we've also included in this is the relationship. So the link between the different requirements or other types of content, also the type of provision, which means is this a requirement, is a recommendation, a permission or a possibility, or is it something else? And also the applicable phase, in which phase of the project is this particular requirement relevant? So you can talk about the design phase, the use the implementation phase, the use phase, or the maintenance phase, particularly if you look at large construction projects. So this is the information module, the smart structuring table part of the information model, where we are at this particular moment, which we're attempting to test out within a number of pilots. So this are just some basic examples of basically smart requirements. And you could say we've established a number of rules that a requirement needs to adhere to. First of all, singular. One of the first things that we were advised was that when you write a requirement, it needs to be a single requirement which can be verified on its own. If you have a set of requirements put together, which is very often the case within standards, and they need different methods of verification, then that makes it exceptionally difficult for the people using the standard. So the requirement should be singular. It should be verifiable. It should, in principle, be positively formulated. And extremely important, it should be unambiguous. In virtually all the conversations that we've had with end users of standards, one of the biggest problems that they have is the ambiguous nature of many of the requirements. And what's the consequence of that? That they have endless discussions between the supplier and the person who's actually put in the order for a particular piece of work. So, and that creates confusion as to what actually are the requirements. Where do they actually have to adhere to? The rationale, again, is an issue which has come up consistently. Again, the person that we spoke to a company last week, and they told us that the rationale was for them essential to understand why that requirement had actually been decided on, what were the thoughts behind that, in order for them to be able to assess for themselves how they needed to implement that particular requirement. That's something which is largely missing from the majority of standards at the present time. There are a number of other rules. One of them is traceability. This is some work that we did at NEN on the Dutch standard, so I would advise you not to try and read the text, except for obviously there's a lot of English text in there, but the text of the standard itself is all in Dutch. But the reason I wanted to show this was in terms of traceability. So what we've also looked at is the fact that every single requirement and actually every other piece of content within the standard needs to be identified and needs to have its own unique ID. By giving each requirement a unique ID, you can then more easily link it to other requirements which are of relevance within the particular standard. Now, obviously, the challenge as we move on is that you don't only want to link to the standard that you're working in, you want to be able to link in the same way to requirements in other standards and bring all that content together. But the use of the creation of individual granular elements of content, and then at the same time giving them a unique identification, makes it possible for our end users to find and extract the content that they need, and to be able to use it, for instance, in their requirement management systems. What you can also see here are two elements. That's the requirement type, and that is to some degree linked to the system breakdown structure. So we're talking about system requirements, where you could be talking about the activity or the integral aspect of a system. You could also be talking about a requirement which is aimed at verification or the method of proof, or you could be talking about a requirement which is basically a process requirement. So again, by adding metadata, enriching the content with new metadata, we make it increasingly easy for the end user to find and to use the content as they need it. And obviously, as I said before, the applicable phase for the requirement. So this is where we are at the moment within the project in the Netherlands on one element of the information model. I'm now going to hang back over to Sebastian to go into the other model that we're also looking at the moment.
Perhaps I will take the opportunity just to answer Robert's question right away, because Robert, what you asked regarding granular requirements that should be traceable in the systems of our users. Exactly this ID, for example, that you have seen here might be one key to achieve this link to ensure traceability. And of course, it might be a service in the future to allow update services or information services based on these IDs whenever there's a requirement that has been changed, for example. But we can come back to the question later again. So there's another model, as Joe just mentioned, that we are testing at the moment, and this is something that we have learned for the European pilots, that we don't have a final answer to many questions. So we are looking at different approaches that we are testing in these pilot projects, and beside the smart structuring table, we have another example here of an information model, or first step of an information model, the triple structuring table. And what you can see here, I'm not an expert able to explain you all the details, but what you can see here basically is that we tried, some colleagues in our working group, we tried to adapt or to further develop a smart structuring table Joe presented to the semantic triple approach that you might know from the semantic web, for example, the resource description framework, RDF, where we try to break down these main elements such as condition, system, action, performance, or margin into this triple structure. What you can see here, and we have developed a small tool helping to feed these structure by transforming a sentence in natural language that you can see here in the example on the left, if temperature is above 50 degrees Celsius and so on, and to transform this into a triple structure where you can see that we break down the condition, temperature is above 50 degrees Celsius, or pressure exceeds 50 megapascal as a condition, in itself a triple or two triples connected by an operator OR, and then connected to the main triple, we could say, consisting of system, action, and performance, where we have two requirements. The pipe shall be made from material according to, connected by an AND, and here in the bottom you have the second requirement that is connected by this operator AND, and so on. So I don't go into the details. It's just to show you that we are working on different approaches or different models, looking at standards. Of course, there are standards providing some guidelines or some basics for information models, and where, for example, the triple structure is proposed for the representation of requirements. And so this might be something that is helpful to perhaps not to achieve the immediate next step of level 3, but perhaps yes, we don't know. We are testing this in the next pilots, as I said. And what you can do, of course, if you have huge amount of content structured in these triples, that you can ask specific questions to the content database, where you can identify these main elements and access the content in a different way, because a system might understand the meaning. You can create ontologies based on these triples. What is important to know is that you can structure everything in this triple model. As you can see here, it's a quite complex requirement structured in this triple format. So it's important, if you do this modeling into a triple structure, that you make sure that other rules regarding unambiguity and clarity of content is met before you transform into this structure. Because if you think about machines, for example, posing a specific question to a database where all the content is structured in triples, it's even more important to have the content clear and unambiguous. Otherwise, the software will not know what to do. The pilot project approach, and what Joe already explained, where we are at the moment in the pilot 3 and 4, here in the middle, the product standard and the new work item. And The very important red box here, which is managed through a fifth pilot that we call information model, that is led by Ivan Salcedo from BSI. The idea is that we will pick up the results from the pilot 3 and 4, and to further develop our information model based on this output. And the idea is to have one main point where all this information comes together, and the idea is to have one refined information model that can then be aligned and further developed together with other partners, for example, at the international level with ISO and IEC, but also, of course, with our colleagues from the American SDOs. And what we have learned so far, and this is really important, we think we have to combine the top-down approach and the bottom-up approach. So top-down meaning that we have to achieve a common understanding of smart standards and a very broad alignment, the broadest possible alignment with other SDOs and on the international level in order to achieve a common model of smart standards. As we have said in the beginning, for our end users that are using very different types of standards or very different types of content in general, to have different models of machine readable content might be difficult. So the idea is to align on top down, but to be able to start and to get started in a possibly agile approach. This is what we tried, at least in Europe. It's not always easy. There are many discussions, controversials, and it's not easy to coordinate this. But we were able to start. We started in 2018 with concrete pilots, and we have now the fifth pilot being prepared. So this is for us a suitable approach to get started on our way, and to do this together with the end users, to understand the end user, try to validate results from the pilot projects together with end users, try to find use cases that help us to validate what we have done so far, what we have learned so far, and of course to look at the entire value chain from content creation to content delivery and the usage of content. So it's not a single shot for the content creation areas and our standardization organizations. It's also something we have to talk to our mainly to our publishing areas, who will provide in the future smart services instead of documents, hopefully in some future, and of course doing this together with the end users by understanding better their needs. And with this, I would like to hand over to you, Tom, to give us some insights from your daily life and the work with standards. Thank you.
So yeah, my name is Tom Shortall. I work for Shell as a standards manager, but I'm also talking as the chair for a task force in IOGP. That's the International Association of Oil and Gas Producers. And the task force is looking into digital implementation of standards. So how we follow the standards through typically the project process to deliver outcomes through specifications for provision of goods and service, and obviously confirming that they're delivered correctly. So I'm going to talk about two changes that we need to consider. One is how we write the standards, good content. And to be honest, that's whether you're still selling a book, but it really is essential, as both David and Sebastian have illustrated. It's essential for the digital content. And also, we want to talk about how you deliver the standards to us as digital consumers. First of all, writing good content. I'm going to borrow some experience here from an IOGP group called JIP 33, Joint Industry Project number 33. And that is a collaboration between 12 of the major oil companies, and also now involving suppliers and engineering houses, to look at how we can improve the overlays that we write to the industry standards. Because unfortunately, the standards that we're provided with, particularly in the oil and gas context, are just not good enough to use straight off the shelf. We have to put additional content in there or take content out to deal with the ambiguity, the vagueness, and the other issues that that Joe mentioned, so that we can get an acceptable result, a predictable, repeatable outcome to the required minimum needs. And of course, being individuals and individual companies, we all end up with different overlays. So the JIP 33 is saying, well, let's all get together and have a common agreed overlay to these industry standards. And those specifications that they've developed are published and are openly available to the community for use, and hopefully the more you use it, the more commoditization and standardization there is in our industry. When they're putting together this JIP 33 activity, and of course in standards in general, there are a few essential inputs to get a good quality product. And you'll recognize these. They're the same in any of the work you do, to have clearly defined boundaries, solid technical content, and that not only from the writers but also from the community, to make sure it's good. But we need a bit more as well. We need to have good quality requirement writing. And the JIP 33 found that they needed to invest time into really delivering that good quality outcome and requirement writing to be able to get something that people would actually implement in a common approach for the industry. And the aspects that Joe talked about in terms of the features or the attributes that go with the good quality content. You've got rationales, justifications, structuring, and I don't mean the structuring that you apply in the ISO example of having section 2 is your normative references and section 3 is your terms and conditions. It's actually the structure of how you to manage your standard so that it's usable and comprehensible and follows a logic flow for the user, so they actually make the right decisions with it. There are tools that can help the authors, whether it's the Fonto style of tool, and also you've got some of the tools that were shared last year at the Tech Forum with QB Scribe and others that can help with the authors. But as David's illustration with API 17.0, the author, the writers, need help going from a prose mindset to a good requirement delivery. And in the API context, we had the NCOSI specialists helping. In the JIP 33 context, we went through some training and support for those requirements writers to try and get them to deliver good content. We also had, and this is something that I think we need to consider from standards development organizations, we had a cold eye review. We had something that's not an editing check, but a good requirement check put in as part of the writing process. The JIP 33 followed a fairly standard process. You go through the initial scoping, shaping, and then you go into drafting, public review, and final draft and review, and so on. So you're probably thinking that's what we do. We do that in our standards. The difference is that they're doing that from when they do those reviews, they're doing a requirement quality review as well. They're really asking, are we being clear? Are we being unambiguous? Is it precise? Is it verifiable? Is it well argued? Is there a good justification to it? And it's a facilitated review that helps the technical people make sure they've got the right content. And it's not just about having the tables looking pretty or following the basic formatting rules. Key to this is getting everyone on the same page. David gave the example with API of having in the 17.0 of having the workshops with the NCOSI people and really getting that hearts and minds piece of how to go from prose to data. And you won't get anywhere if you just land this to a group of technical experts and tell them to go and do triples or to go and just change the way you write. It'll get a firm rejection, and I know because I've tried that, and it doesn't work. You have to bring them along with understanding, but also with hearts and minds. So what we're going to do is just switch now, and I'm going to test the technology and load up a video that we used and we've used these sorts of videos in the JIP33 context as well as internally in my company to try and get that message across. So let's bear with us, and hopefully it'll make you smile a little bit as it goes through.
Hello and welcome to Requirements 101, Module 2, the third in the series. That's right, some genius decided to call the first module Module 0, and in doing so likely confused half of you watching this. In any case, it is important that you have watched Module 1 before passing this point. So if you have not done so already, please stop here and go back to Module 1. It's probably safe to assume that most of you just ignored that instruction, so here is a quick recap of Module 1. Houston, we have a problem. We looked at both an unacceptable and a couple of acceptable definitions for the term requirement. We covered a basic definition that you could use at the bar or at the gym, as well as IEEE's version that we would advise against using at the bar or the gym. Trust us on this. We also propose to you that good requirements writing is essentially a communication skill, not exactly a human specialty, especially in the written form. So it comes as no surprise that 37% of organizations stated that unclear requirements were the primary reason for project failure. In this module, we get stuck into our very first rule, and arguably the most important paradigm shift that we in the oil and gas industry need to make, where it concerns the requirements. We need to start seeing each individual requirement as an individual building block. That is exactly the inspiration for the Requirements 101 logo. Individual self-contained blocks that, when combined and organized with other individual blocks, make the engineering magic happen. As we will start to discover in upcoming modules, the effectiveness of several processes in engineering depend on the ability to identify and work with singular statements. Let's take a look at an example. How many requirements do you see expressed in this statement? There are 3 separate requirements in this statement, all of poor quality. One is a design requirement, the other deals not with design but execution scope, and the final requirement actually concerns testing. One sentence, but 3 different responsible parties and covering multiple design and engineering phases. This is a failed requirement. It is really important that each requirement statement is limited to one quality, one characteristic, one functionality, or one constraint at a time. Just one. If you find yourself writing whole paragraphs using the word "and" multiple times to combine multiple thoughts together in one sentence, or worse still, you mix up your shalls and your shoulds in one statement or one paragraph, then you are breaking an important requirement writing rule, the rule of one requirement at a time. Let's take a look at another example. How many requirements do you see in this statement? There are 3 requirements in this one sentence, all of which need major improvement. But the important thing to focus on at this stage is the number of requirements in the statement. There is also a simple matter of clarity and efficiency. We will now play a game of Spot the Requirements. The following is a segment from a BFD. How many requirements can you see? Did you need more time? Well, have a go at this one. How many requirements do you see? Let's take a little longer. This is 1/4 of one page of a standard that is over 100 pages long. Maybe it would help if we chunked the paragraph into smaller pieces. That's a bit easier to read. So it looks like 6 requirements, each of which we can tick off as we comply or consider their implications. There are a few other issues with this text that we will talk about in later modules. Now let's try one more. How many requirements do you see this time? Easy, right? 4 requirements, 1 requirement per clause, and each one individually numbered. Why make life difficult when there are easier and more efficient ways of working? On our last project, we received clarifications from a supplier with references to a requirement in section 2.2, paragraph 3, second half of the 4th sentence, and all this in the 21st century on a multi-billion-dollar project. Our generation has witnessed a communications revolution, and yet requirements in our BFDs and project specs would be more at home in a textbook or a novel by Charles Dickens from the 1840s. Now, we certainly do have great expectations for the future and the energy transition ahead of us, but on this point, our industry is definitely in hard times. So we must start authoring individually numbered requirements, not only for ease of reference and identification, but also to manage each individual requirement over its entire life cycle. We'll hopefully cover the life cycle of a requirement in a future module. Let's briefly return to one of the requirements we just looked at. Strictly speaking, we actually have 2 requirements here: self-draining and no pockets, and one could argue that the requirements should be split up, and that would be fair. However, we can also use our engineering judgment and see that self-draining and no pockets are 2 requirements that would be executed by the same engineer, that would be located on the same drawing, and would be verified by the same person at the very same time. In cases like these, it is acceptable to use the word "and" to combine these requirements into one statement. It is still short and easy to understand. However, you do need to watch out when wrongly using "and" to combine wildly different needs and requirements. Use your engineering judgment and, if in doubt, split them out. The key takeaway from this module: individual requirements, one need or constraint at a time, each requirement individually numbered, no long paragraphs containing multiple requirements or a mix of requirements and recommendations. From now on, when you think requirements or are about to write a requirement, we want you to recall the Requirements 101 icon. We will change the world together, but one requirement at a time.
Okay, thank you. So hopefully that streamed through okay. We go back to the slides. So those sorts of videos we've put together as part of the change process, because we've got lots of technical expertise in the room when we're doing the standards development. But writing good requirements is a different skill. And just because you're a good engineer doesn't mean you can communicate well. So that's something that we have to work on, we have to help people with. We have to get their hearts and minds so that they're prepared to be helped. We have to assist them so that they can do some of it themselves. And that's essential for whatever change we're making in this digital journey. there are tools that can help, and as I said earlier, you saw some last year being demonstrated, and we use them as well. And it'll pick up whether you've got, you know, 2 shalls and then a load of ands and that sort of thing in your content. But as David showed in the API example, it ends up coming back to people having to figure out, well, what's the right solution on these things? And that's where you need a technical writer, whatever you call them, somebody who's actually looking at the requirement quality in the work process. In the JIP 33 process, they followed a, you know, again, it looks very familiar with the drafting and challenge and that sort of thing. But those checklist points that are in the process, they're not just an editorial check or a technical content check, they're a requirement quality check, and where people got more familiar with what good looks like and helped coach the developers and get some good quality content. So it's an engineering review, and that means changing the work processes in the standards development. So authors can be trained, they'll sit through videos, some of them might even sit through to the end of the video. As you saw the starter, someone will probably skip through. When we were doing the JIP 33 training, we sort of mixed it in between some face-to-face. Remember those face-to-face encounters that covered some of the discussions. So you can do a bit of training, but even when I'm writing something, when you're writing something, you're going to get, if you want good quality, if you're really concerned about it, you're going to get someone else to have a look and do a little bit of a cold eye review. And that has to be part of our standards process, the really important content. We need to include that as part of our process, and we don't do that at the moment. Now, of course, that's got an impact on resources as well. So secondly, I just want to talk us through as a digital consumer, and again with the IOGP JIP 33 example in mind, they use the digital tool to develop the specifications. Every JIP 33 specification, it doesn't stand alone. It's dealing with an international standard, and it's trying to deal with the issues that we have with them. This is a slide courtesy of IOGP, and it's trying to explain the JIP 33 approach. As I said earlier on, we have, from a supplier's perspective, they've got this this customer asking for a product or service that's based on an industry standard, and each of the customers are asking for different slants, different flavors, different varieties, different overlays. So from a supplier point of view, from an engineer's perspective, everything is unique and bespoke. What we're trying to get to is that we've agreed on the common areas, and then the final differences are just specific to the actual project case, and it's from a selection list. So think of buying a car. It's not 1910s when you were getting a custom coach-built Rolls Royce. You're getting something that runs off a production line, and you've got an options list that you're ticking on, and it's volume, efficient, all that productivity that we heard about at the very beginning of this forum. And it's clear with the feedback from the marketplace, from the ones that have been issued, that there's a great interest and willingness to look at pricing and schedule for this. I had one of our suppliers telling us they currently manufacture upwards to 100 different varieties based on client specifications for one product. So that's not standard. That's not what we're delivering to the industry right now. So we're trying to push into more standardization, but also into productive use. In the JIP 33 process, we're struggling with the fact that we're still dealing with a book document mindset. So you think of it from a supplier perspective. They've got a book on their desk that is the industry standard. They get a book that lands on it, which is the JIP 33 overlay. And they get another book that comes on top, which is the project specification with all their options. Now, you might tell me that you've advanced to level 2 and that you've got, these are PDFs now. Well, thanks, that means I need 3 screens open. At least in the past, I was able to staple a page into a book and draw a red pen. Now I've got to balance all these options. And it's really quite difficult to do. So the second part of my discussion is we're really after an ability to integrate all those requirements into one digital specification that we can share with the supply chain. What you see on the left is the digital tool at GIF33, a snapshot from what they're using to manage the content. And what it does is it takes the skeleton structure of the industry standard, and then it tries to fit in all of our overlays and underlays and connections into that skeleton. And the things that we're linking into, not just the rationale, but the verification that goes with that requirement. Is there a quality need for it, testing? Is there an information, a documentation, or other requirement, and so on? We're trying to tie all that together so we can then link it through into that next stage of machine application where you can reconcile the needs. But right now it's into blank spaces. So there's a content structure there, but we've got nothing in it. What we want to do is to be able to populate that with an XML or other source content from your standards, and so that we can integrate it, have one book, hopefully digitally, an actual digital consistent approach, but one specification that covers the whole story. It covers the things that have been transparently deleted, transparently added, how they're verified, things that have been selected as applicable and not applicable. Now that obviously addresses the business model for sharing standards. It also has to do with not only the commercial side, but legal exposure and that side of things. But it is something that we really need, and we need you guys to be working on. Just to summarize, we need the quality content. Tools can help, training can help, but the work process that you employ in the standards development and the resources you employ have to include this requirement quality check. And lastly, we need those digital content put into our requirements management systems so that we can get an integrated specification through the supply chain and to be productive. So if I can hand back to Sebastian.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you very much. Very interesting, and I think this is in huge part what we are hearing from customers at our side as well. And so what is driving us in our project of smart standards. And I would like to hand over to you, Joe, for some closing remarks before we pick up the many questions we got on the chat.
Okay, thanks very much, Sebastian, and thanks, Tom. The video was really good as well. But just to say, I think this subject has been on the agenda of the Standards Technology Forum. This is certainly the 3rd year that it's been on the agenda. And I think each year we've put forward a request to cooperate on a global international level, ISO, IC, and CENELEC, the NSBs, the SDOs, in order to achieve a common understanding and the broadest alignment. Because the fact is, in the end, users like Tom at Shell and all the other companies that we know of and the people that we talk to are not waiting for 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different solutions. They want one solution. The people I was talking to on Monday, a big engineering company, they use ISO standards, they use ASMEs, they use APIs, ASTMs, they use a whole varied selection of standards in order to run their processes and talk to their suppliers. So they're not interested in having 6 different solutions. They need one. Unfortunately, we would have to say that even after kind of putting out this appeal, that we're really not an awful lot further in bringing this process together and learning from each other. So basically, we agreed we need to put this appeal out again, and we need to work out concretely how we can actually do this and how we can actually learn from each other as well. Secondly, I think as Sebastian already explained in the previous presentation, we need to look at the entire value chain, from content creation to content delivery and usage of smart standards. Although I think, as he already said, we need to start at the end of that process, the usage of standards. And I think, if I'm honest, I've been at NEN now for 25 years. And I think it's only really been in the last few years that we've seriously begun to listen to the end users of standards. We've always listened to the experts in the technical committees, and we've always assumed that they represent the needs of the end users. And the fact is that that is simply not the case. The mindset in the technical committee is different because of the pressures to achieve that content is different to what the end user at the end needs to receive from us. And I think we need to recognise that, and we need to really be talking to those end users, which is why, as I said before, we've agreed that in the European projects that everybody should set up stakeholder groups in order to talk to their end user and to understand exactly what they're doing and the challenges that they face, some of the things that, that Tom put forward just now. Also, we need to work with trade associations. The example of IAGP is an extremely good one, to get input from them on this transformation process, and to agree with them, as we agree also with the director end users, the common XML attributes or tags that will be needed in order to be able to allow them to pick up the content that they need and transfer it into their own systems, into the requirement management systems, and mix that with the other content that they need to use. So again, we come every single time to the end user, the need to understand the end user, setting up national stakeholder groups, talking to the right people in those companies. We need to make sure that we're actually talking to the people that are actually using those standards, and not talking to the people who manage the platforms, but to actually get down to the facts, to the use cases, in order to validate the work that we're doing. We need also to choose an agile approach, an agile iterative approach. It's what we've attempted to do in Europe. I'm not sure whether we're particularly agile. We're trying, but we've very definitely got an iterative approach where we're constantly going back and checking whether or not the work that we're doing is correct, that we're on the right course, that we're thinking of the right things, that we know what we can do and what we can't do, and coming up, as it says here, with achievable targets. The agreement to adopt good requirement writing will probably mean that the directives that we work to at the moment will have to be updated. That the work processes that we work with at the moment will have to be updated and changed in order to make this possible. And I think the explanation that Tom gave just now, which is what we're trying to work out in the pilots in Europe, is that you can't simply go into a technical committee and say to them, no, you've got to write good requirements. It simply is not as easy as that. It requires a completely different mindset in how you actually look at what a standard is, how that standard is actually thought of, and actually created. So it's a big job that we've got. And one of the things that I've said to people quite often, certainly if you take the ISO family, the ISO, the IEC, Sensenelec family, it's a little bit like trying to change the direction of a massive luxury liner. It's a big organization with thousands of experts around the world participating in the production of standards. It's not an easy job that we've got, but if we don't get onto it in a very basic, down-to-earth way, then we won't actually get there. What we also need, and I think Tom pointed that out just now, we need to develop clear ideas around IPR and DPM, DRM models, which will allow, which will, on the one hand, will protect the NSBs and the SDOs on the one hand, and at the same time will allow our end users to use our content as they need within their systems. And I think just finally, we need to say that we need to build on the work that's already been done. It's not a question of everybody starting from scratch, but we need to begin, and we need really to do it directly. We need to understand the urgency of this question, because the fact is that if standards bodies within the next 4 to 5 years maximum don't solve this problem, then somebody else will. So I think we need to say we need to begin directly with joint pilots on the lines of what we've been attempting to do in Europe. And nobody would claim that what we've done in Europe is perfect, but we have attempted to push on very concretely with the pilots that we've been carrying out to see if we can achieve some end results. So essentially, what we're using the opportunity to basically put this appeal out there to say, how can we pull together both the ISO, IEC, CENELEC world, also obviously the SDOs, not just in America, but also other countries, to get other important countries involved in this process so that we can move on.
Okay, Joe, thank you very much. We have some 6 minutes left, I think, and I would like to pick up some questions we got. Robert's question had been answered also by Ivan. Thank you, Ivan. I hope that fits. Leslie, you asked the question, thank you to the project team, to the Smart Standards team. Could some of you participate in conversations with industry? Yes, of course. I mean, let's talk about this. I think it's important to improve our storytelling, both to explain why it's important to participate in projects, also to participate in future activities to train experts on good requirements writing, but also to structure the content in a different way. Happy to participate in this. Dennis Kilian, are these structures intended to be used as training examples for machine learning? I don't know if someone of our group wants to answer this question. I can only say that on the national level, our partners from the electrotechnical side, DKE, they have a pilot project where they try machine learning or artificial intelligence to support the classification of requirements. But perhaps someone of our groups wants to answer. Joe?
Well, just on that, because I think Sebastian, as you know, at DIN, but also at UFNOR and NEN, we've been using machine learning in order to attempt to recognize the requirements in existing standards.
Yeah.
The work that we're doing in the European pilots at the moment in order to create a completely different type of standard is not really related to machine learning. But obviously, if we manage to achieve that, then machine learning can maybe along the way help us in that process. But that's not the focus at this particular moment in time.
Absolutely. Tom?
If I can add as well, one of the frustrations we have, and it's a question later on, what are the challenges with doing this work on the standards? But one of the frustrations we have is that a person can't understand the standard content, and sometimes even going back to the technical experts and asking them, what does this mean? They don't really know. So we cannot expect machines to read and interpret content as it is at the moment. We need to actually be writing content that people can use and apply and interpret correctly. Machines can follow on afterwards. The vast majority of use of our standards in the near to mid-term is going to be people reading them and applying them. And hopefully their productivity will be enabled and supported by machines. But that's what we need to be aiming at, and that's why we need to focus on the quality of the content first and foremost.
Okay, thank you. There's a question from Steiner Mullen regarding smart requirements from Equinor. Regarding smart requirements, are you standardizing on systems, breakdown reference data, and other metadata? And in case, how? This is a question that can be answered by you, Joe, or by David or Scott.
I mean, I refer to system breakdown structure because certainly the initial projects that we did, we had assistance from systems engineers, and they explained to us the whole basis of the system breakdown structure and how they worked in creating smart content. Whether specifically that impacts on the work that we're doing at the moment, to be honest, is not clear. One of the questions that we asked during the construction pilot to the end users is, which information do we need to enrich the content with, apart from creating smart requirements. And it's still not clear at the moment whether or not that's information which we should or even can add into standards, or whether that's rather a job for the end user companies.
Thank you, Joe. I hope that answered the question. Then we had a statement from Cord that there's an ontology project going on at the moment, so happy to hear that we mentioned ontologies and the triple model. Then we had 2 questions regarding the JIP33 that had been answered by Tom. Hope that is that answers the questions. And then we had one last question regarding what challenges did we face while trying to convert our standards into requirements. I mean, our standards consist of requirements, but trying to convert them into smart requirements. And this is basically what we have done so far in the first set of European pilots. Joe, I mean, if you want to, perhaps you want to answer this one.
Well, in the first certainly the construction pilot, we did actually take 4 European standards, and we attempted to convert them into the model that we've now the draft model that we now have. And what we found was that it was incredibly difficult because there was an awful lot of information missing. So the object is it's not first and foremost to convert standards in the existing standards into requirement-based documents, but first and foremost to establish how new standards or updated standards can be written as requirement-rich documents, as opposed to the prosa documents which we produce at the moment. Once we've achieved that, we can then look at, are there possibilities then to convert existing standards into requirement-rich documents? But that's kind of a second stage.
And what we are doing now in the pilot new work item, as we call it, that we are trying together with experts create content from scratch, or to establish a new standard according to the actual information model, so that we will, for the first time for us at least, really try to work with experts and trying what it means for them to establish content in a smarter way. But this is just starting. We're in the preparation of this pilot project. Okay, I think that's it regarding Arno. There are 2 more questions. Yeah, here it is. From Cord, from DIN Software. To Joe, when I see the progress made in API or in COSI, or the examples of Tom, as well as the concrete results achieved in the Sensenelec environment, I get the feeling that we are getting somewhere. I support your plan to keep exchanging info and in the end achieve a joint understanding of how we can move from level 2 to level 3 and in a few years time to level 4. Eventually, in the end, we may even end up standardizing the stuff we talk about. Okay, this might be our final statement. Thank you, Cord. I think there are no more questions from the audience, so I would like to thank you again. Thank you, Tom, for your time and for your presentation and for your input, and thank you to all the other presenters as well.